Jung said, unless you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. We only attract people who have the same level of dysfunction as ourselves. It's a hard one for a lot of us to come into contact with because for many of us, it's like, they're the fucked up ones, right? Like they're the ones that are screwed up. Shame says there's something wrong with me. And this is what happens for a lot of men that live with a tremendous amount of shame. And so we have to start to separate our sense of self with the things that we do. We as men actually need to grow deeper, stronger roots into who we are as men. That is our power. That's where we find potency. Yes, building things in the world can be very impactful, but if you've ever been around very successful, very grounded, very mature men that you just gravitated towards and wanted to learn from, what you are feeling almost always, whenever I've talked to men, they resonate with this, is that they're feeling into a man who has grown down into himself. He knows who he is.
Raw, uncut, and unapologetic. Welcome to Men Talking Mindfulness. Such a man knows that whatever is wrong in the world is in himself. And if he only learns to deal with his own shadow, he has done something real for the world. That's a quote by one of the grandfathers of modern psychology, Carl Jung. Today, our guest is Connor Beaton of the very popular podcast, ManTalks, who is here to help us unpack what the shadow is and how we can use shadow work to transform our lives. Connor, it's an honor to have you here. I'm a big fan of ManTalks. Thank you so much for joining us today.
You bet. Thank you so much for having me. I love that you opened with Granddaddy Jung, just bringing the Carl Jung quote straight out the gates. Love that.
Exactly. It gives us something to come back to. It's like, what the hell does that mean? Hey, so, and everyone that's listening, thank you for being here. mentalkingmindfulness.com to see what we're doing out there in the world. And, thank you for being here. What's going to help us grow is if you leave a review, like, subscribe, and share, and even take a moment and, send a text to a friend with this particular episode and, help us grow and changing lives as well. Beautiful. We're just going to, Connor, we do one breath to ground. We're a mindfulness podcast, so it's really important to understand how incredibly powerful the breath is as a means to just calm us down, get us more into the moment, and kind of light up our brilliant self on the inside. So we're just going to do one breath. We're just going to exhale all the way out. Maybe close the eyes so you can feel more of the flow of that breath. And let's take a big, giant inhale through the nose. Big belly breath. Keep going a little bit more, a little bit more. Let's hold here for 3, 2, 1, and exhale, let it go out. Okay, amazing. All right, I thought, Connor, I'd start kind of flipping things a little bit. I thought instead of getting right into what is a shadow and what is shadow work, I thought we'd start with why is shadow work so transformative for people that do this work?
Yeah, shadow work is especially transformative for men because men generally have a denser shadow. And maybe what I'll say about that is within masculine culture, it's very common that how we have been taught to find strength is through suppression. Right? So the more that I can stuff it down, the more that I can ignore what I'm feeling, the more that I can hide and neglect and reject the parts of myself that maybe I perceive as weak or I perceive that society or women are going to perceive as weak, then the stronger I'll be. And this, from a sort of tactical standpoint, from anybody that's ever been in the Marines or a Navy SEAL or in the military in any way, shape, or form, what you'll find is that hiding your weaknesses or pretending that those weaknesses don't exist is a major fundamental flaw. That is one of the most detrimental things that you can do in the military, and yet this is what we teach men to do as individuals, right? So we say, we've kind of been grown and raised around fathers and generations of, real men don't cry and big boys don't cry and this type of stuff that really leads to suppression. So what ends up happening is that there's a whole bunch of stuff about yourself that you just genuinely don't like. And there's parts of yourself that you're hiding, and there's parts of yourself that you think are weak or inferior. And the truth is that those elements of you, those aspects of you, they don't disappear. They don't just go away. We can't kill them off. We can't sort of, put them into a sort of like hurt locker down in the basement of our psyche and not expect that they're going to come back to bite us in the ass. And so, Jung said, unless you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. The way I say this is your pain as a man has its own intelligence. And if you don't learn how to deal with your pain, you will either pass that pain on to other people that are around you that you love and care about, or it will get in the way of your goals and your ambitions and your direction in life. And you will wonder why you continue to sabotage yourself. So that's the sort of tactical piece of it.
Yeah. Actually, my co-host John, who couldn't be here today, he's actually a Navy SEAL. Like he was a SEAL for 17 years, and and I'm sure he would have a comment. Maybe I'll have like a little ancillary small episode about that, and him talking about like, the shadow and how what he's been suppressing, and also like how he's been taught to kind of suppress with that masculinity. He's like macho, too much light in that. Okay, so let's get into what the shadow is. So help us understand what is meant by shadow, so it doesn't sound so like woo-woo or dark or mysterious.
Yeah. So to make it very practical, if you grew up in a household where, let's just say your father was pretty aggressive and he had a lot of anger and his anger was all over the place and he'd flip out and you didn't really know when he was going to be okay or if you were going to piss him off. For a lot of young boys, when they're around that type of hostility and volatility, what ends up happening is they start to cut themselves off from their anger. And so they'll say, I never want to be like Dad. I never want to be like him. I never want to be an angry man. And so what do they do with their anger? It's not that their anger disappears. It's not that they become a man that doesn't have any anger, right? That's the definition of psychopathy, is that you don't feel any emotions. It's that your anger gets repressed. It gets hidden from you. You start to disconnect from it. And there's real damage, right? This is what we call the people pleaser, the nice guy. People pleasers and nice guys are generally just men that have, in some ways, disassociated, disconnected from a sense of healthy anger. They've repressed it. And because of that, they have poor boundaries, right? They don't say no to things. They don't assert what it is that they actually want. They don't speak up for their needs. And then they end up getting into a relationship with oftentimes a woman that has more of that aggressiveness, more of that anger. And it replays this dynamic oftentimes of them being in relationship with that angry or aggressive parent, whether it was mom or dad. So it really is about reclaiming what has been discarded in the shadow. I'll give you one more example and I'll pass it back over.
Yeah.
So for some men, they may have rejected their own anger because they see it as dangerous. They see it as violent or hostile. And so they've disconnected from it. It goes into their shadow. Okay. Mm-hmm. And it'll come out, they'll be passive aggressive, but they won't set boundaries, et cetera. For other men, they may have grown up in an environment where, let's just say that they had a very similar situation, aggressive dad, or they had a very hypercritical mom that was constantly, criticizing them, shaming them, putting them down. They were expected to perform, and they didn't really get a lot of compassion as a child. And for them, what could be in their shadow is a sense of self-compassion, the ability to say, oh, I failed, I screwed up, that's okay, these things happen. And then maybe you grew up in an environment where accidents were not okay, right? Where if they messed up as a kid or, they didn't do well on a test, they were not just scolded, but they were embarrassed. They were criticized in a hostile way. And what it taught them was having compassion for myself is not something that I'm allowed to do. There's something defective or wrong in me. So for some men, in their shadow will be a sense of self-compassion. And so when you get into their inner dialogue, and I've worked with, so many men at this point over the last decade, what you start to notice is that how they speak to themselves is almost, if not sometimes, abusive, right? They're speaking to themselves in a highly abusive, highly aggressive, highly volatile way, and there's no compassion. It does not enter into the equation. And so that can be something else that gets thrown into the shadow. So the shadow isn't just all of like your pain and your hurt and your trauma. Those things can be in there, but it's also the attributes attributes, characteristics, and traits that you actually need in order to be a more effective self-led man, a more whole and complete individual. So the aim isn't to kill those parts off, right? Your inner critic, your inner dialogue. It's not to kill those parts off. It's actually to learn how to integrate them and give them a different function, a more meaningful purpose.
Yeah, well, it makes me think of I don't know if you or maybe you're aware of like IFS therapy,
Yeah.
internal family systems, and it sounds like that's like what when they talk about those parts of yourself and how they're protectors and managers. It's like sounds like that's the kind of the waking up to the shadow. It's like what I enjoy what you're saying. It's like we're not trying to fight the shadow, push it away, like because it's just even the word shadow. It's like, oh, it's supposed to be dark. It's supposed to be like stay underground and not brought to consciousness. But here, like when we do, begin to understand our shadows, and I think you bring up a great example about anger, because that's one thing that men really struggle with is anger. But by also like naming it, also being aware of it, and then kind of listening to the message of it, like you're saying, like you really use it as a tool to transform. I think you bring up a great example of like developing more self-compassion. And this is something that's really helped me. Just like, I have a very fucking volatile, like negative voice that too often is sabotaging me and telling me, what not to do and how to be in the darkness, if you will. But it's definitely good. I mean, it's definitely very, very valuable to understand and be with the shadow as it is and learn from it. Well, what are some of the things that you've done in your own life? You've done a lot of, this is like a core of your work, the shadow work, but how were you brought into this work, and then how have you seen this work transform in your own lives? And don't be afraid to tell a story of like, you do work with a lot of men and how that's transforming them.
Yeah, I mean, I came into this work like a lot of men do, which was through crisis. I bottomed out in my late 20s, and on paper, on the surface, I had a great career going. I was traveling the world. I had motorcycle, Mustang. I thought it was cool. Maybe for some people, they're like, well, the Mustang's not it for me.
It's fucking
But
cool, man. I like a Mustang.
there you go.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
I had the 5-liter, 95 Mustang, and I had a 1,000cc sports bike, and I had a great relationship with this incredible woman. But behind the scenes, I was a complete disaster. I was lying, I was cheating, I was abusing substances. I really just felt completely out of control. I didn't like who I was. I didn't like the decisions that I was making. I had a lot of self-loathing and self-hatred. And, I think I just generally kind of felt like a fuck up. That's sort of the clinical term. And the resources that I had sought really weren't that effective. I had gone to therapy once or twice, and it didn't really seem to do it for me. Maybe I could get some emotional relief, but it didn't really give me any direction. And so it's like I would have a little bit of emotional relief, but I'd still have the same damn problems. I was still a disaster. and eventually my life fell apart. It all sort of came to light. All the lying, the cheating, the behavior all, sort of flooded forward at once. And I was questioning leaving the career that I was in at the time. My relationship fell apart. I lived out of the back of my car for a few weeks after my relationship ended, and my then girlfriend moved out, and I just put all my stuff into storage. And I was really ashamed of who I had become as a man, and I didn't like who I was, and I was so ashamed of my actions that I just didn't want people to know what was going on.
Mm.
And so, I did that for a couple weeks, and like some 6'1", 200-pound white dude living in the back of his 2007 Pontiac G5, which was not comfortable.
Yeah, yeah.
Not just jammed in there like a sardine. And then, eventually started to tell people what was going on. And two main things happened that put me on the path that I'm on. Number one, I had a mentor in my life who was in his 70s, and he had a background in Jungian psychology, and we ended up chatting, and I ended up working with him for about 2 years, apprenticing with him, like a real old school apprenticeship where, I'd pay him for his time and for his wisdom, but also when I didn't have enough money, I would, chop wood and help him with his asparagus farm and help him with his Rottweilers. And, I just sort of supported him because he was in his mid-70s. And he taught me, he really taught me a lot about the human psyche and how we work and operate. And I learned a whole bunch of therapeutic modalities from him. And that happened over the course of a couple of years. And the other thing that happened was when I started to talk to people about what was going on and be honest about how much I was struggling behind the scenes, I started to meet a lot of men who were dealing with the same thing, where on the surface, everything looked great. Their business looked great. Their relationship looked great. But when I would be honest about the struggles and the challenges that I was dealing with and what I was going through, my friends that I thought I knew would open up and talk about how the business wasn't doing as well as they said it was, and how their relationship was struggling, or, that they, them and their girlfriends or their wives hadn't had sex in, 8 months or something like that. And
Mm,
all of a sudden the mask was put down and the
mm,
performance was set aside. And it was
yeah.
just two men talking about the realities of their life.
Mm,
And that really came to a head when I had a conversation not too long after I lived in my car with one of my buddies that I went to university with. And he shared that a couple of weeks before I opened up to him, he had tried to take his life. He had tried to hang himself.
Jesus.
And
Right.
I was really rocked by that because, we kind of, we were very close friends, and I knew what type of booze he liked to drink, the beers he liked, the movies that he liked, the books he liked to read, the type of women that he liked to date, what he wanted to do when he got older. But I didn't know that he was struggling so bad that he, tried to end his life. And he didn't know that I was struggling so bad behind the scenes that everything had imploded and I ended up living out of the back of my car. And I didn't end up living out of the back of my car because I didn't have money. I couldn't afford to go live in a hotel or with somebody. I put myself there because I thought that's what I deserved. I really thought that I deserved to just be secluded away from people because of my actions. And so that was a kind of moment where I was like, man, what the hell, like, why can't we as men just have more meaningful conversations with one another and have more transparent relationships? And I just started to see this over and over and over and over again, where men had sort of surface level relationships with one another. There really wasn't a lot of depth, I realized. And so, yeah. And so that kind of put me on it lit this spark that would, a couple of years later become the organization that I would create and the mission that I would create.
You brought up a good point about, or I want to actually talk a little bit more about shame, right? And how does shame keep us, being a slave, if you will, like to the, manipulation of the shadow? Like, how does that kind of keep that, that negative loop kind of, and then negative behavior? I mean, here you are, you talked about, you're living in your car and you didn't think you deserved anything better.
Hmm.
And so how does shame or does it kind of play into this work with the shadow?
I mean, shame is immense when it comes to the shadow, but I think I'll just maybe personalize this to the listener instead of to the shadow, because I think it'll help, hopefully. Shame does a couple things. Shame, number one, for most men, shame is the emotion and the experience that they try and live the furthest from.
Hmm.
So
Wow.
we as men, we are okay with experiencing anger and rage. We're
Right.
okay with experiencing even grief and deep sadness and sorrow. We might hide it from the public or from our people,
Mhm.
but we'll let ourselves sort of touch it. We might let ourselves experience joy and those types of things. But usually embarrassment and shame are the experiences that we try and live the furthest from. And so when that happens, they are very deeply rooted in the shadow and they have much more control, much more influence over our lives. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that for a lot of men, shame is, there's a concept that I've created called shame-based motivation, or a dark motivation. And what happens is that when we grow up and we feel ashamed of certain parts of who we are or what we do, not feeling good enough to get dad's affection or praise, not getting mom's love and attention enough, never comparing to an older sibling, that lives in us. And for a lot of men, what we do is we try and utilize that shame as a form of motivational fuel. So it's like, I'm going to disprove dad. I'm going to disprove mom. I'm going to disprove this story that I'm not good enough, that I'm a piece of shit, that I'll never amount to anything, that I'll never be as good as, whoever it is. And so we start to try and leverage that shame, that pain inside of us of lacking a sense of self-worth and value to try and achieve something. And for many men, this works. This is the kind of weird, strange thing about it, right? I can't remember who it was, Bill Burr or Theo Von or some comedian said, nothing makes a great man like having a dysfunctional father. And it's like, yeah, it's kind
Very
of fucked
true.
up, but it's
Right,
kind of true, right? I mean, you look at a lot of the men that have achieved greatness, and generally what's happened is that they've tried to leverage this pain and this shame inside of them to go and achieve and create and build. The problem is that it has a shelf life. And for many, I've worked with famous rappers and musicians and athletes in the NFL and the NHL and Fortune 500 CEOs and entrepreneurs and hedge fund owners. And so many of these men have this thing happen where they are trying to use shame as a way of achieving results. The problem is twofold. Number one, they really struggle to feel any type of meaning and recognition because nothing's ever good enough, because their fuel source is shame. So of course they can never be enough. So it puts them in this negative feedback loop. I got to do more. I got to do more. I got to do more. And the second thing is that shame will always leave us with a net negative impact. And so you'll get to a point where you've achieved all these things, but because you can never celebrate, appreciate, or honor yourself, it begins to dry up and it begins to feel empty and meaningless and purposeless. Or in order to keep that shame-based motivation going, you start to fuck shit up. You start to have the affairs, you start to do drugs, you start to sabotage your career and your finances because the only way that you know how to drive yourself is through negative emotion. So shame plays a huge, huge role in a lot of men's lives. And the last thing that I'll say about shame, because I think this is very important, is that shame oftentimes in a man's upbringing, when he's a boy, is used to gain compliance. So if you are
Shit. No, I'm feeling that. I'm like, fuck, dude. Like, oh my God, so much manipulation, with shame in some ways. But go on, continue.
Yeah. So I've worked with a lot of men who grew up in a household where dad wasn't around, and they were raised by a single mom, and they're wild and physical and feral, and they, the only way that mom can kind of get control over them is by using shame to gain some type of compliance. Or they have a father that doesn't know how to deal with their energy and volatility as a boy, and so he'll start to deploy shame as a means to gain compliance. And so when you look at the physiological and psychological imprint of shame, it causes us to become submissive. So for a lot of men, what's happening is the shame that they're carrying inside of them has robbed them of a type of agency and authority. And they're more willing to comply to social narratives, to what their partner wants. This feeds into the nice guy and the people pleaser, but they're also more submissive to life. And they'll struggle generally to try and really pursue their ambitions and their goals and their dreams, because there's a kind of not cowering, but there's a kind of like, I should be in this submissive role. I'm not actually allowed to take up more space and occupy more space and say what it is that I want and have very specific needs. So for a lot of men, shame is the thing that's compressing their life and keeping them psychologically, financially, physically, emotionally quite small. And it's the thing that we have to bump up against. So shame plays a huge role in most men's life.
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely still does in my own, and it's getting better, but it's like it's really big. Well, so for shame, like, what is like, where is a place to start? Like, to try to transform, but obviously become conscious of it first, and then understand it. But like, where are like just like a, I know it's just, I'm sure it's a huge body of work. It's years of work, but like, where are the first place to take a look and start to pick that apart, and then use it to transform um, with the message that it kind of has or brings you.
So for anybody that resonated with what I just shared, there's a great book by a guy named John Bradshaw called Healing the Shame That Binds You. That can be a good book to go into. He was a great psychotherapist, and he put together a wonderful body of work. And the book is actually quite tactical. So it gives you very specific things to do and to confront in order to start to work through your shame. So yes, step one is really building awareness around where the shame is in your life, how it's actually constricting you and keeping you small, how you might be using it as a fuel source to try and achieve, and to see where those narratives came from. Where did they actually come from?
Mm,
So did it come from mom shaming you about being like your dad or being an angry boy or an angry man? Did it come from dad, sort of shaming you for the 95% and not having like, where's the other 5% chronically, right? Never really giving you the praise and validation that was deeply needed. So starting to see what are the origins of that shame. Where does it live in my life today? How is it constricting me and causing me to be small? And then what are the decisions and choices that I can begin to make that are going to press out against the walls of shame? Because for a lot of men, and again, I really want you to use this kind of analogy, shame is kind of like this orb, this sphere that you end up living inside of, this bubble that you end up living inside of. And the stronger the shame is, the more a man will feel literally constricted from expressing what he needs in a relationship, from setting a boundary or saying no with friends or family or his wife or spouse. Um, it will constrict his capacity and ability to even know that he has worth and value to pursue the things that he wants and desires in a career, with his body, with his finances. So to just start to say, here are the needs and wants and desires that I have in relationship that are going unexpressed, and then to slowly, incrementally start to bring them in. And my recommendation for all men is start with something that is small and something that is actionable. A lot of the times men are
right.
like, I'm ready to do the work, and they choose the biggest, most confronting thing,
Yeah.
and
Right.
then it never happens, and then it reinforces the shame, right?
Yeah.
So we
Right.
want to have, with shame, you want to use SMART goals, right? Specific,
Right.
measurable, attainable,
Hmm.
realistic, time bound. You want to have very specific things that you are expressing, and then being able to say no, being able to express some boundaries. I didn't like that. I don't like it when you do that. Please don't say those things to me. Those types of boundaries are going to be very important, because what you're doing is you're saying, I have enough value to stand up for myself. And for men that have grown up in a very shame-based environment, they either lack the ability or the willingness to stand up for themselves, or they feel like they have to do it in an almost explosive kind of way, right? And so they end up, having like a lot of volatility and a lot of aggressiveness, because, anytime that they feel constrained, it's like they just blow up. So those are some of the specific things that guys can begin to do.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah. That's shame can, well, just for so many people, but like it just awful, 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 awful shame.
Can I say one
Yeah.
more thing that's super
Absolutely, my
important?
man. Yeah, I love it. Yes, please.
Separate personhood from behavior. Okay. I'm going to explain what this means. So when guilt says what I did was wrong, right? So that choice, that action, that decision, that wasn't a good idea, and sometimes guilt is a very useful thing, right? It's like, that was wrong. I shouldn't have done that. Shame says there's something wrong with me. And this is what happens for a lot of men that live with a tremendous amount of shame. And so we have to start to separate our sense of self with the things that we do. And this is hard for a lot of men because we as men are often trained, you are what you do and you are how well you perform. And for many men, it's like, oh yeah, I didn't actually get love and affection and attention when I was a kid unless I performed. And so for some men, being able to untangle, I'm not what I do, and I'm not the actions or the decisions that I make. They are a part of me, but they are not all of me. So separating personhood from behavior, the watching the porn, the making the bad decisions, those types of things are not who you are. They are just simply things that you do, and you can correct them. And so being able to have a process in place that says, you know what, and I'll give you an example that I do with my son, because this is something that we can do with ourselves. When my son gets something wrong, I started to notice, he's 4.5. I started to notice that he'd get really hard on himself, right? He'd like be pissed off with himself and he'd be angry and he'd kind of get like a little tantrumy. And so I started to work with him and say just something very simple. I'd sit him down, I'd sit in front of him, I'd hold his hands, I'd say, take a breath with me. And I'd say, there's nothing wrong with you. That what you did was just not okay. You're a good boy. And I would say these words verbatim. You are a good boy. And what you did was not okay. That's the separation of personhood and behavior. Who you are is good.
Yeah.
What you did, not all right. Who you are is good. What you did, not all right. And so we as men, a lot of men that have grown up in a shame-based environment, they never learn that. So their sense of self is intrinsically merged and meshed with what they do. If they perform well, they're good. If they perform bad, they're bad. And that's the equation that happens. So we have to be able to work with that. And with a lot of men that I've worked with, I'll actually say you need to pause and do some type of this very same experience. I'm a good person. What I chose was not okay. What I did was not okay.
Yeah, that's a great distinction. And just by creating an identity around like really who you are, that brilliance on the inside and not what you do, I could just see how it's just so incredibly beneficial. And it gives great opportunities for like, okay, what's next? Like now that I know who I am, like, what do I want to do? Or I don't need to feel that way or think that way anymore. I've heard you say that, that every relationship is a mirror for self-reclamation. So, how does relationship? What does relationship kind of teach us about ourselves and the shadows that we have?
Yeah, I mean, Jung had this great quote where he said, and I just keep quoting Carl Jung.
Yeah,
Apparently.
he's the man, right?
I do know lots of other psychologists and authors,
Yeah.
but this is about shadow work. So,
Yeah.
he said the fastest racehorse to individuation is marriage. And individuation is about the process of self-wholeness, self-actualization, really getting to know who you are as an individual at your core. And the reason for that is that intimate relationships are the clearest, most reflective mirror that we have in life. And all of our stuff will come up in a relationship. And there's a funny, my wife is a marriage and family therapist, and she came up with this saying that I think is so true, which is that we only attract people who have the same level of dysfunction as ourselves. We only attract people who have the same level of dysfunction as ourselves. And it's a hard one for a lot of us to come into contact with, because for many of us, it's like, they're the fucked up ones, right? Like they're the ones that are screwed up. But relationships are really where your insecurities are going to pop up, your fears, your doubts, your worries. I think lots of men have talked about how one of the most important decisions a man will ever make is the woman that he decides to spend his life with. And I know I'm speaking in a heterosexual context, but people can take that and alter it however they need. But I think that's very true, because in many ways, your shadow, your fears, your worries, your doubts, your dreams are all going to be made manifest in your intimate relationship, because you are sharing the deepest parts of yourself with another. It's the opportunity to be known in a way fully that you might not be known in other contexts or dynamics. And so if that's true, then all of ourself will try and belong in the relationship. And I see this happen all the time with men where they're like, man, I was doing okay in life. And then I met this woman that I really wanted to spend my life with and fell head over heels. And all of a sudden I became a complete mess. All the
Yeah.
stuff that I'd been hiding and trying to suppress in other relationships and other parts of my life, boom, there it was.
Yeah.
Right? Why is
Yeah.
that? Well, because we want integration. We want wholeness. We want to be loved and known for every part of who we are. That's a intrinsic desire within the human psyche.
Mm.
I'm going to pause there and see what your thoughts are on that.
No, I think it's one thing, like absorbing your work and learning about your work. It's like that, like when you're triggered by somebody, right? That's like also, that's kind of your shadow being triggered. And that's like a part of you that maybe you want to take a look at because of this like kind of mirroring of effect that kind of the shadow does with another person. And it really makes me stop and think and analyze what you're talking about. Like, I'm still single. Like, I've been trying to figure it out for a while. Shadow work will definitely help. But, being seen in relationships can be very scary. And if you're really going to fall deeply into a relationship, there has to be like a tremendous amount of vulnerability to be seen. And that's like for a lot of men and even myself, like it's kind of like, it's tough to go there. We're kind of programmed into vulnerability being like weakness in some way, but it's really like exactly the opposite. By being seen by the other person, and understanding like when you are triggered in your most intimate relationships. Like I have a couple brothers, and my God, do they just bring up so many different things in me. My parents, like so many different things in me, like my closest friends. I'm like, fuck, dude. Like, and how is like when you are triggered in that way, or unless you have a comment, what I was kind of saying, and then we can kind of go into something else. But okay.
Yeah. I mean, I think, we often attract partners that are, how do I say this? We choose partners based on what we think we want, and we almost always attract partners based on what we actually need. And those two things are usually different. What we think we want as men is like, here are the things I think I want in a partner, in a woman. And then there's the things that we actually need. And sometimes those can be fundamentally different things. And it can be hard for a man to reconcile with the truth that what he says he wants might be something a little bit different than what he actually needs in order to be happy and fulfilled and
complete, whole, right? You
complete
talked about, right.
and pushed. And so I see a lot of men getting into relational dynamics where, it's the honeymoon phase ends, the relationship starts to hit some bumpy patches, or conflict starts to happen. And there's a lot of finger pointing to the other side. It's like, well, if only she wasn't this way, or if only he wasn't this way. And the couple starts to get into this rut or this groove of blaming the other person for the problem instead of looking at what am I contributing to this dysfunction. And, my wife and I have a saying that helps us to come back to that, which is, I chose you. I chose this. And that's it. I chose you and I chose this. Not you're doing this to me,
Right, yeah,
because
yeah.
for so many people, they get into a relationship and they start acting like they're a hostage. They start acting like you're doing this to me. It's like, no, motherfucker, like you chose that person. And
Right.
you have to start to find out not just the parts of you that you're conscious of that chose that person, but what are the parts of you that you are unaware of that also chose that person. So what you're saying is very important, which is that your reactivity is a kind of neon sign that's saying, hey, the shadow's at play. Your insecurities are coming up, your shame, your embarrassment, your fear, your anxiety. Those things are being activated when you are reactive. And that's what you need to look at. What happens for a lot of us as men is that we're very external. And so when we get angry and reactive, we very much like to analyze externally, right? It's like, what's she doing? What's happening in the relationship? And we can get caught in this external analyzation of what's going on, trying to assess the problem. and we miss out on what we're doing to contribute to the issue. Now, there's caveats to that because some men only collapse into them being the problem and they don't set a standard for their relationship or for their woman. And that is problematic in and of itself. So I'll just leave that sort of caveat there.
No, it makes me brings up the question for me. It's like how much, like, because you talked about the external, and our identity, which is, usually it's a program that's running in our head and just keeps looping and just keeps trying to find, external circumstances, situations, and people in order to kind of continually keep that program running. But this work like takes us much deeper, and especially when we're talking about relationship here, it's like how much of this work really starts to open your heart, right? Which is packed with so much incredible wisdom. Um, so how is the heart involved in shadow work?
Yeah, I mean, my I think my work is less, and shadow work is less about this kind of ascension-based growth. A lot of men will approach personal development or therapeutic work like it's the stock market. Stocks go up.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. It's
And
a
it's
great
like,
way to fucking put it. Yeah,
I want eternal
yeah,
growth, right? I just
yeah.
want to keep growing.
Right. Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
and for me, it's less about growing up and externally or up and out, and it's actually about
Mm,
growing down and deeper into yourself.
mm,
We as
love it.
men actually need to grow deeper, stronger roots into who we are as men. That is our power. That's where we find potency. Yes, building things in the world can be very impactful, but if you've ever been around very successful, very grounded, very mature men that you just gravitated towards and wanted to learn from, what you are feeling almost always, whenever I've talked to men, they resonate with this, is that they're feeling into a man who has grown down into himself. He knows who he is. There's a depth of wisdom and connection to self, not in an arrogant way, not in a way that he's trying to prove to the world. He's actually just unapologetic and very, very rooted into who he is. And that's really what this work is about. It's it's about being able to say, what am I contributing to this? How am I partially a cause for this? Uh, what am I doing? How am I being that's causing this rupture or this disruption? And then being able to take ownership over it. It's
Wow,
a
that's excellent.
different type of maturity and masculinity that
Mm,
has become very vacant within our culture and our society, where
mm,
extremism and polarization is running rampant. And at the extremes, it's never the individual's fault who's occupying that space of extremism and polarization. It is always somebody else. Somebody else is always at the core and the epicenter of the problem. And that is a lacking of maturity. So to come back to that quote that you said at the very, very start of the show, when a man can see what is wrong in himself or is a problem in himself and he can do something about it, he's doing something just for the world because he knows that the problems within are also the problems without. So we as men are going around oftentimes trying to solve the issues of the world, and are sometimes very ineffective at that, or we feel helpless to do anything about whatever it is, right? The war in Gaza or climate change or Ukraine or the government or $37.5 trillion of debt. And it's like, I can't do anything about this shit. Yeah, no, you likely can't. But what you can do is pull the nets in and you can begin to insource some of that shift and some of that change.
yeah, what you're talking about the self, and to come back to, I was really taken, very captured by IFS, and they talk about the self, and they say there's actually 8 C's and 5 P's that kind of go along with the self, and this and when you activate the self, you get self energy, you become self led, and I don't know all of them, but like it's like courage and compassion and creativity and curiosity and connection and compassion, and like the P's going like presence and persistence and playfulness, and this is like the stuff that's already deep inside of us, and like you're saying, it's like it's and I think makes me think of Michael Singer. He's like, we don't have to reach for spirit. You can think of like we don't have to reach for the self. We just need to peel everything else away that's getting in the way of us like really accessing our true power, which is the self. So how does um, how does psychedelics help, or can they help with shadow work and kind of diving into this work and coming up with these realizations?
That was a great left turn into psychedelics.
I know, right?
You were like, so how does psychedelics? I was like, oh yeah,
yeah,
psychedelics. Like,
yeah,
let's
it's
go
fun
there.
to talk about. I know, exactly.
That was wonderful.
No, thanks.
Well, I think one of the best things that the sort of pioneers of modern psychology started to talk about is the unconscious. And the unconscious is sort of the vast totality of everything that you do not know about within yourself. And Jung had a framework where it was, we have our personal consciousness. There's the subconscious, which is, you can imagine yourself standing on the tip of an iceberg that's just poking out of the water. That's consciousness, right? That part poking out of the water is consciousness. You can stand at the edge. You can peer into the water. You can kind of see a little bit of the iceberg underneath. That's the subconscious mind. And then there's this monstrous unconscious underneath that. And that's this sort of totality of everything that you do not know about yourself. And then Jung had a concept called the collective unconscious, which is the sort of collective unknowingness or unconsciousness of the human species that sort of interconnects us all through archetypes and symbols and mythology. And, there's a lot of continuity between different cultures and religions and different variations. There's themes that show up across cultures. So that's the collective unconscious. Psychedelics is interesting because when you are young, when you're a kid, you have access to that unconscious, right? You're pre-verbal, so you don't have really a lot of language, or your language is very basic. You are pre-memory, so you don't actually have a lot of formations of here's what's going on. You are just a sort of extreme present being to what's happening in the world. And when you take psychedelics, in many ways, what it does specifically is it shuts off something called the default mode network. And your default mode network is responsible for that internal chatter, that sense of ego, that sense of identity, the part of your brain that's commenting on how you're doing constantly or whether you're doing it well enough. It really turns the dial of that almost completely off. And you are able to access the unconscious experience in a much different way. You're able to access unconscious content and material and ideas and truths, but you're also just able to experience the world in a way that you were able to access when you were quite young. And for a lot of people, that can have a very formative and healing and nourishing quality to it. Because for the average person, they can't get out of the ego on a regular basis. They can't separate or create any space and distance from the incessant chatter in their head. And suddenly you take psychedelics and that voice that's in your head that's commenting on everything, that has something to say about how you're fucking doing everything, it just quiets, goes to sleep. It's calm. And so you have a completely different experience that can support you in healing traumas or getting through attachment issues. But a lot of it is putting you in contact with the shadow, with the unconscious, with the heart, with the emotions that maybe you've buried, right? If you're somebody that hasn't let yourself grieve the end of a marriage or relationship or the death of a parent, and all that grief is stuck in your shadow and your unconscious, then you can, sometimes you can have a psychedelic experience and suddenly, boom, there's all of the grief and the anger or the sorrow that you've repressed for months or years. So it can be very, very helpful.
Yeah, it is. It's been transformative for me, for sure. Like I've done ayahuasca, psilocybin, and LSD, and it's just like it's just nice to have that ego dissolution and just really, again, get into that subconscious. And there's a tremendous amount of like peacefulness and love and like self-kindness that kind of comes through, which it just feels so good because We can, like you mentioned earlier, we can just be so hard on ourselves, and that default mode network just continually telling us like we're a piece of shit, or like I hate the over fucking analysis of things and the judgment of different things, and just to turn that off a little bit and just see a different part of our humanity has just been so transformative to me and everybody that um, that I've experienced that with as well. Um, Cool. So like maybe one more question, and then please tell us how people could find you and how they can plug in and do the work with you. But what about mindfulness? Like we kind of touched on a little bit, but how does like a mindfulness practice, a consistent mindfulness practices help us to enhance the shadow work that we're talking about?
I like to think of mindfulness as a return to our natural state of awareness, right? Our natural
Love it.
state is
Yeah.
just awareness. And
Mm.
our potency as men comes from being able to have, some people in the military or the Navy SEALs would call it situational awareness, right? Being able to have awareness of what's happening. That's a very specific type of presence and awareness.
Mm.
But mindfulness is a kind of a more dispersed quality of awareness where your awareness isn't captured or fixated on just your thoughts, right? So many men, when they come to work with me, as I'm sure that when they come to work with you, one of the things that they're being plagued by is all of their awareness and their focus and their attention is just on the thoughts that are constantly going through their mind. And there's no real break, there's no separation. They're completely captured by them, or their escape is like porn and social media, and, and that's
Yeah.
when they
Yeah. For
get the
real.
break from that
Yeah.
shit. But
Yeah.
mindfulness is really this return to having a broader quality of awareness where you have some distance, a little bit of separation and space
Hmm.
from what you are and what you're observing. And this, Jung had I'm just going to Jung again. He
All
said, what
good.
what you cannot separate from, you cannot heal. Right. So if you
Love it.
can't
Yeah.
create any space
Hmm.
between you and the anger and you and the rage or you and the ruminating self-judgment, if you can't create any space from it and you just are that thing, you actually
Hmm.
can't work through it. You can't heal it. So
Wow.
we have to be able to create more mindfulness, more awareness,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
create that separation. And the last thing I would say is, the body, this is a much bigger topic maybe for another time, but I'm going to open it up anyway.
Yeah.
The body is the mind of the unconscious. Your body is the vessel of the unconscious. So your unconscious mind is the body. And your body has, in psychology, there's a concept called the elephant and the rider. And the rider is the brain, and the body is the elephant. And the elephant has a massive amount of power. And sometimes the rider is telling the body where to go. But if the body wants to really make a decision, there's nothing that the rider can really do to override it. And so for the average man, being able to get into your body and have awareness in your breath, in your physical form, is going to connect you very deeply to your sense of intuition, your sense of self, your sense of what you want and need, your voice. So we have to be able to get out of the mind and have some deeper connection with our physical form in order to really truly know who we are. And most men are just living above the neck. They're just living up in their head, and they're completely disconnected from heart, from gut, from physicality. And being able to get into those parts of ourself is in many ways a pathway to a deeper sense of self-realization.
I love it. And there's so much deep wisdom in the body. And also one thing that's in there, and I've heard many teachers talk about like the great natural peace that's within us that helps us to connect not just more deeply to ourselves and what we desire, but also gets us in that collective, because it's all like the whole world is a lot of it's organized in a peaceful way. And when we be able to sit, like I'm working, I have several meditation students that I work with, and I just want to get into the body. And like you said, it's like finding your breath. It gives us a natural way to calm down our nervous system. We're able to kind of begin to create a reference point to that piece. Get into the body. And then over time, like it's a practice, you just got to keep showing up. You got to put the time in. Sometimes it doesn't feel like like anything is fucking happening. Cause we, like you said earlier, like it's that linear projection, like, well, if I meditate for 10 days, I'm going to be 10 more days, whatever that is, whatever you think it is, but it's not. Like it can go south for some time because it's like, oh fuck, like I got to deal with this. And you might be like accessing some of that shadow. But it's a noble pursuit, and all this work is a noble pursuit, and it definitely takes a time, takes a teacher, takes a mentor, takes a lot of practice, takes years, but it's worth the effort because of how much clarity that is going to create consciously, but also physically, but it's really going to unmask and unleash, like really who you can be and what you can really do in the world. And like to come back to what Carl Jung said, it's like, you've done something real in the world when you start to do this work. So thank you so much, Connor, for being here today. How can people plug into the work you're doing? I know you have a new program that you're releasing, which sounds really exciting. So, where can people find you and work with you?
Just ManTalks everywhere. ManTalks, ManTalks on Instagram, on YouTube, on Spotify. And you can go to mantalks.com. I've got a book called Men's Work where, I've designed it to really be a practical tool that you can use to do this work. And then if you're looking for support, we have the ManTalks Alliance. We've got about 1,000 members in there from all over the world. And I've got courses in there, pathways. I lead live calls. There's tools and tactics that you can use to lead yourself more effectively, whether it's in your life, in your relationship, a sense of meaning and purpose. So you can check that out at mantalks.com.
I love it, Connor. Thanks for being with us today. And hey, and thank everybody for listening that's out there. And we'll put a bunch of information in the show notes here so you can check that out. And so you can take go a little bit deeper into this work. And ManTalks and Connor Beaton's podcast is excellent. He just, just like you did today, Connor, you're really very impressive as far as just the clarity and the delivery. And you can see that you've really done the work, but you've put in the time in order to make this happen for yourself. So congratulations on all your success as well. And thank you for being here. Peace, everybody. Have a great everything.
Thank you for joining us today. We hope you walk away with some new tools and insights to guide you on your life journey. New episodes are being published every week, so please join us again for some meaningful discussion. For more information, please check out mentalkingmindfulness.com.